Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's episode, we want to have a brief look at three very concerning conflicts, wars, civil wars that are taking place on the earth presently. And these are very serious civil conflicts that have killed hundreds of thousands of people, have displaced millions of people, and yet, here at least in the United States, possibly in Western Europe, other nation states around the world, you will have very little information about these conflicts. Here in the United States, a couple of years ago, we had and still have remnants of the BLM, or the quote-unquote Black Lives Matter movement. Now, that far-left movement here in the ununited States absolutely had no concern with what was happening in sub-Saharan African nation states, especially the likes of what you see here that's taking place in Sudan. Sudan, you had the Sudanese army, and then you had a paramilitary organization known as the Rapid Support Forces. The Rapid Support Forces were originally deployed and designed to deal with an insurgency that was taking place in southwest Sudan. This paramilitary force became incredibly powerful. It was backed by other nation states, had its own leadership, command and control structure, and was very well armed, and had seen quite a bit of action in terms of its deployments in battles that had taken place inside of Sudan. Now, the government of Sudan, the military, the army, the Sudanese army, and the Rapid Support Forces, these paramilitary units had a falling out. And this falling out led to an armed conflict. So essentially two very, very powerful generals, one commanding the Sudanese army, the other commanding the Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary element of the government of Sudan, went to blows. They engaged in combat. One wanted all the power. And like in the Highlander, there can be only one. And that is what has happened. This war has raged for some time, killing hundreds of thousands of people and displacing millions of people. If you look on the map here, you can see the nation state of Sudan. The green area is the area controlled or possibly controlled by the Sudanese army. The area in this yellow color is areas controlled by the Rapid Support Forces. Now, you also have other groups that are starting to position themselves in the conflict, and that's a very, very bad sign for Sudan as a country. You are watching the breakup and the breakdown of an actual nation state that, in all probability, if there is not one absolute victor in this conflict, and or the two parties come to political terms, which is somewhat doubtful at the moment, that we will see Sudan form a failed state. Now look, Sudan is not a small country. It is a very large country with 50 million people. It borders Egypt, Libya, Chad, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, all of which are at risk of being drawn into this conflict or suffering the repercussions of this conflict. If we zoom in, we can see really where some of the heaviest fighting is taking place. This is the capital, Khartoum. If we zoom in a little further, we can see where some of the most heaviest fighting is taking place along the famous Blue Nile River. There are ongoing battles for locales along the southern portion of the Blue Nile River. You can see recently the government forces of the Sudanese military have regained control over areas just to the south of the Blue Nile, crossing from kind of what would essentially be northern Khartoum to the central southern portions of Khartoum. You can see the government buildings, such as this locale here, which is the headquarters for the Sudanese military, and oddly enough, they have shaped these buildings in the form of their service branches. So obviously an airplane for the Air Force, half of a naval vessel for the Navy, then obviously you have the Ministry of Defense and the Army itself as well. This right here is the General Command of the Sudanese Armed Forces. And you can see the damage that has occurred because of the ongoing conflict. You can see many of these buildings have suffered massive amounts of damage. If we go over to the main airport, and the airport also serves as a military staging base as well, a military air base, you can see the damage that has been done to the aircraft. Now, the Rapid Support Forces, the group that controls this yellow area, does not really have an air force. However, the Sudanese military still has a moderately capable air force. It has the ability to conduct ground attack missions with a variety of ex-Soviet, Russian, and Chinese-made aircraft that are primarily used in a ground attack type of role. And we're zooming back in here so you, the viewer, can see just some of the damage that has been done to this airport in the ongoing fighting, and it is rather significant. But the fighting that is taking place between these two fairly capable military forces, again, the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese military, have damaged cities all across Sudan, killed tens upon tens upon tens of thousands of people, and it is very heavy, very intense fighting that is taking place. And both sides control significant portions of what was Sudan. And again, you are also seeing offset groups that are now arming themselves and making power plays within this conflict. At the same time, we have long-standing disagreements that exist between Sudan, Ethiopia, Sudan, Eritrea. Obviously, there are hostilities between the breakaway South Sudan and Sudan proper. At one point, South Sudan was part of Sudan and broke away through military conflict, through a large industrial scale insurgency taking place in South Sudan against the Khartoum-based government. Now, the Sudanese military, the guys here in the green, have the benefit of getting direct support from the Egyptian military. Egypt is supporting, to some extent, the Sudanese armed forces. Now, there have been reports that elements of Russian paramilitary groups, such as the Wagner Group, have reportedly, in some cases, offered support to the forces of the Rapid Support Forces. But again, an incredibly brutal conflict that is not at all being reported on, that is taking place. Very dangerous for reporting personnel, pool reporters, journalists, to make their way into Sudan and then try to report on this conflict. Incredibly brutal, incredibly dangerous for reporters. Thus, not a lot of information comes out of this conflict. You hear reports that come from the Sudanese government or the military, the Army, the Navy, Air Force, and then you get reports from the Rapid Support Forces, which is the opposition force that is fighting the Sudanese military. But again, in and of itself, the Rapid Support Forces were at one point part of the actual Sudanese military apparatus, paramilitary force. But we're going to continue to try and bring you more reports on what is happening with this conflict. Just of recent, the conflict has really picked up, especially in the capital, with some recent advances by government forces crossing the Nile River, the Blue Nile, and capturing some areas in central Sudan. So we'll continue to report. We'll continue to watch this very closely as the war continues to possibly even escalate. Another conflict that is not being reported on very much is the civil war that started back in 2021 with Myanmar. As you know, a military government took control of Myanmar. And out of that military takeover rose a rebellion of various groups. Now, this map will give you a pretty good idea of what the conflict looks like currently. So the area in the red, as you can see here, is designated junta, or that is the actual military forces of the armed forces of Myanmar that are engaging these various opposition groups. The actual name of the military forces, as opposed to calling it the junta, is the State Administration Council, the SAC. But for whatever reason, Wikipedia has decided to call it the junta, which is a name one would use for a military controlling said state. But its actual name is the SAC, the State Administration Council. Now, the opposing forces are a hodgepodge of groups known as the National Unity Government. The National unity government. That doesn't really look so unified, does it? This, with the various colors that you see here. Look, we'll kind of start from the west. The Chinland Council, the CNA. The Chin Brotherhood Alliance. The Arakan Army. The Mon National Liberation Army. The Romanya Joint Column. The Karen National Army. The Karenni IEC. The Shan State Army South. Shan State Army North. Wa State. MNDAA. TNLA. And the Kachin Independence Army. And then obviously the People's Defense Force. So a hodgepodge of groups and different ethnic groups that have not necessarily banded together, but have attempted to take up arms against the armed forces of Myanmar. Now, if you look at the map, now on the surface, it would appear that the government, the military, the quote-unquote junta, the State Administration Council, has completely lost control of things. Now, that would be somewhat untrue, and I'll try to explain why. If you look at the major population centers, Mandalay, Rangoon, Nai Dau, and I hope I'm not butchering that, and if I am, I apologize. These are the three largest cities. And not only that, the regions in which these cities exist, especially, for instance, Rangoon. The entire region, the entire province, the entire state of Rangoon is controlled by the military. Most of the adjoining state just to the west is controlled by the military. If you look to the east, most of the coast is controlled by the military. Only in the west, you see here, the Arakan Army, they control coastlines, but for the most part, the military controls all the ports. So all the ports and infrastructure that can be accessed by sea are controlled by the armed forces of Myanmar, also known as the Tatmadaw. Again, go up here to the administrative capital. Again, the entire state controlled by the military. Mandalay. Mandalay is the only region where you have kind of the northern areas just to the north of Mandalay that have a infestation of the People's Defense Forces. Now, this the fighting that is taking place is absolutely brutal. There are reports that as many as 76,000 people have been killed, and possibly tens of thousands of more that could have been killed in the ongoing fighting. From the some of the video reports that we have obtained that give examples of the ongoing fighting, it is absolutely brutal. Now, going into this conflict, the Myanmar Armed Forces were a fairly professional military and still actually remain a very professional armed forces. Not only that, many of these large cities, Rangoon, Mandalay, in these areas that the military control, they still have production capacity to build armored vehicles. They have the ability to produce weapon systems, ammunition, and munitions for their military. Myanmar, the military of Myanmar, the Tatmadaw is also being directly supported by the Chinese. Now, the reports that you will see from time to time would indicate that the rebel forces, this loose coalition of rebel forces, are on the verge of victory, or could be on the verge of victory. These quote unquote democratic forces. That is not the case. The Myanmar military, again, very professional, and still control most of the country that is worth controlling. The state institutions are all under the control of the military, quote-unquote, junta. So this conflict is going to last in all probability for quite some time. And again, an incredibly brutal conflict. Thousands of people killed. Tens of thousands of people killed. Millions of people displaced. Especially in some of the more rural areas. And that will continue. That will continue for quite some time. There's no end in the horizon, on the horizon, with the exception of at least one party winning a total military victory. And again, the military at this point is nowhere near defeat. I would argue that in many cases, the military of Myanmar has the advantage and will continue to have that advantage for some time, especially with its ability to utilize its air power. It controls an air force, has an air force, and uses that air force against some of these rebelling groups. And then finally, the last conflict that we're going to have a very brief look at is the ongoing civil conflict that is taking place in Ethiopia. This is an incredibly dangerous situation. Obviously, you have the dictator operating out of the city-state of Addis Ababa. You have various factions and groups that are opposed to Abiy Ahmed. You have the Oromo Liberation Army. The areas in yellow are areas that are controlled by the OLA, or the Oromo Liberation Army. And it's very difficult for government forces to operate really anywhere outside of Addis Ababa in Oromia. To the north, you have the Amharan region. The area in gray is controlled by Fano, a Amharan paramilitary force that at one point directly supported the Abiy Ahmed loyalist forces, including the army and the Republican Guard. I mean, every dictator needs a Republican Guard. Have you seen that common thread? Everyone needs a Republican Guard if you're a dictator, right? Well, Abiy Ahmed has a Republican Guard as well. And he's using that Republican Guard to maintain power, arrest rivals, and suppress opposition. And he also uses it to prevent the military, the possible military, from rebelling against his grip on power. So you have in Oromia, this area here, the OLA fighting the central government, and at times fighting other Oromos as well. Amhara region, Fano. Fano, elements of Fano are actively resisting Abiy Ahmed's attempt to dissolve some of these local regional forces that have existed for quite some time. And then you have the region of Tigray, a de facto independent area. This map has it incorrectly as if it is completely under the control of government forces. It is not. The Tigrayan Defense Forces still exist. They are spread throughout the region of Tigray and could pose a very serious threat to the Abiy Ahmed loyalist forces. But again, Ethiopia is a powder keg waiting to explode. And just to the west, northwest, you have a civil war, a high-intensity, industrial strength civil war taking place in Sudan. You have a older and quite possibly getting closer to death dictator, Isaias Afwerki, in Eritrea. What happens to Eritrea when that individual dies? So an incredibly precarious region between the civil wars in Sudan, the civil conflicts that are taking place in Ethiopia. These are very large population areas. I mean, Ethiopia has about 100 million people, if not more. So if Ethiopia were to go up like a powder keg as well and see all-out civil war taking place in terms of all of these regions eventually wanting to break away from Abiy Ahmed's grip on power, you have a large faction of the Oromo people that do not support Abiy Ahmed. You have very disgruntled factions in the Amhara region. I know a few Amharan businessmen that have fled the Amhara region, now reside here in the United States. I have interacted with several members of the Tigrayan community as well, and they all definitely do not like Abiy Ahmed. Now the problem also is they tend not to like each other as well, meaning Amharan versus Tigrayan, Amharan, Oromo. It is a bad situation that could get much, much worse. This could become an incredibly serious conflict. It has been a serious conflict in the past, and then you inject the possibility of famine and what have you. Incredible amounts of human suffering could occur. But again, three major conflicts that you just won't hear about in the mainstream media. The uninformed urbanite, in all probability, that exists here in the United States and Western Europe and where have you, probably could not locate, well, I'm not going to say probably, they cannot locate Sudan on a map. Not possible. Myanmar, same issue. Show it on the map. Couldn't do it. And that's really unfortunate. But what's really cool is the listeners of this program can locate Sudan, Myanmar, Ethiopia, Tigray on a map. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate you watching. And as always, thank you for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.